Today's headlines. European leaders panic as they risk hyperinflation to impose full federal union. The UK economy shrank more than the BBC thought in the first quarter. NATO tells Russia to get stuffed over its missile defence shield, and the UN finally admits the Syrian opposition is being armed through Turkey. Hello, it's Friday the 25th of May. I am not Malcolm Massey, and this is the UK Column News. While last week's G8 summit in Camp David was promising all kinds of unachievable outcomes, like Greece staying in the euro behind the scenes, preparations were being made to deal with the reality that Greece will not. On Monday this week, the European Working Group, the so-called experts who advise European finance ministers, held a telephone conference call to begin making plans for a Greek exit and to try and work out how much it will cost each Eurozone country. According to a Citibank report highlighted by yesterday's Financial Times, asset managers and pension funds were cutting their exposure to the euro and moving into US dollars. It looks like real panic, but it could get worse unless policymakers act decisively and massively, a manager for the AXA insurance giant told the Financial Times. What he means is more massive bailout, which, as the UK column has been highlighting for several years, now is the policy of hyperinflation. The bailout policy is being echoed by other political and economic leaders who are demanding the largest flood of liquidity the world has ever seen, or money printing as it is otherwise known, in a final desperate act to save the bankrupt system. At last week's G8 meeting in Camp David, David Cameron echoed demands for ever greater levels of the hyperinflationary bailout. There's a growing sense of urgency that action needs to be taken. Contingency plans need to be put in place, and the strengthening of banks, governments, firewalls, and all those things need to take place very fast, he said. Cameron's comments followed those of financial controllers, among others, including the Financial Times HSBC currency chief David Bloom, the Bank of America NOMA's Bob Jandua, Gary Jenkins of Swordfish Research, and none other than the arch financial terrorist Gordon Brown. The Financial Times warned in an editorial on the 19th, should the spectre of a deposit run materialise across Europe, and the ECB and unnamed Euro funds would have to step in and recapitalise banks. HSBC currency chief David Bloom said the central banks will have to step in massively and that it will be a soothing balm for the markets. The Fed is already leaving the door open for more quantitative easing. The Bank of America assumes that the ECB steps in with massive support, backed by the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and key central banks along the lines of concerted action in 2008-2009, including a pan-European system of deposit guarantees. Nomura's Bob Jandua said the Europeans will blink with renegotiate the bailout terms with Greece. Whatever happens, we think the Fed and the ECB will respond over the next week or two. Gary Jenkins of Swordfish Research, previously head of European credit research at Deutsche Bank and global head of credit research at Barclays, was more to the point. The global central banks are going to respond with the biggest flood of liquidity the world has ever seen. It will make the LTRO look like small change. Gordon Brown foresees unstoppable runs on the banks. In an article in the New York Times entitled "Crafting a Global Rescue for Europe," as if he is qualified to craft one, Brown makes it clear that he's referring to Europe's banks and not the political union. The outcome of such a policy can only be complete social and economic breakdown, mass panic, and serious civil unrest. Whilst this scenario might seem far-fetched, we believe European heads of state are playing a very dangerous game, which is already out of control, in order to bring in a full federal European Union much sooner than possible and it would have been otherwise achievable. The first hint of this is the calls for so-called Eurobonds debt, backed not in the name of an individual nation, but by Europe as a whole. Such a federal union will only be presented as the only solution available to prevent the whole of Europe descending into chaos. Whilst this may be the only solution which will achieve the bankers' desired outcome for Europe, it is, of course, not the only solution to this financial crisis. The alternative, which would offer some hope for humanity, lies with Glass-Steagall, and a new system of national credit which would fund the rebuilding of our nations without the need for interest payments to the banks. The European Union has been showing its true colours in Greece over recent weeks. The very strong message to our Greeks is austerity or die. Of course, there is no choice at all, since for many of the Greeks the levels of austerity demanded mean that they cannot afford to even eat. On Wednesday, Greek pharmacists were on strike again. This action hurt no one, since the pharmacists no longer have anything to sell anyway. Pharmacists are owed in the region of €1 billion and can no longer afford to restock. The problem arose following Troika's demands that Athens amalgamate the 13 social security funds into one centrally controlled fund. Central government was then made responsible for this disbursement of funds through that one agency, but it hasn't. With no medicines available, people are becoming very desperate. Suicides amongst the desperately ill and the elderly are almost now commonplace. In the meantime, the Greek government has been stealing money from public investment funds in order to keep paying the debt. These funds are supposed to be used for such things as public infrastructure and other building projects. Without this investment, there is no foundation for Greece's future generations. Perhaps there is an assumption that this foundation will not be required in the future. The UK economy shrank more than expected in the first quarter this year, according to the Office of National Statistics. As usual, the question which used to be asked is who believed the original figures and who is surprised by the revised figures. The BBC's Robert Peston may pretend to be, but we are not so sure. The ONS says the economy shrank by 0.3% in the first quarter. As usual, the figures are expressed purely in monetary terms and do not reflect the reality of people's lives. Rising unemployment, the steady replacement of high-quality jobs with low-quality jobs, the steady shutdown of the high streets, the continuing shutdown of the manufacturing sector, these are the real physical realities of living in modern Britain. It is the fact that policymakers think purely in monetarist terms, which is to blame for their mess that we're in, and explains their absolute unwillingness to offer any real solution. In fact, all that is offered by policymakers are excuses, and increasingly lame ones at that. Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England, recently stated that there is a risk of a second quarter of economic contraction. The cause? An extra day's holiday for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Free banking is a dangerous myth, according to a Bank of England Executive Director Andrew Bailey. Bailey was due to become the chief regulator for the financial services industry when the Bank of England takes over the role of regulator from the FSA in July. Says that customers may think that their account is free, but the costs are actually just hidden. Bailey attempted to use free banking as an excuse for banks' fraudulent behaviour over payment protection insurance and other recent mis-selling scandals. He went on to say that it is difficult for the banks because the first one to start charging for accounts could lose significant amounts of business. Poor banks. The rather pathetic excuse that it is free banking which is the cause of banker fraud does not explain the upcoming interest rate hedge mis-selling scandal, which it seems will be the next banking scandal to hit the courts. Interest rate hedge products were sold to businesses who do not enjoy free banking. It is clear that Britain's new banking regulator is going to be no more than an apologist for the banks at a time when we really need a firm hand. Following last week's UK column news coverage of the anti-human fascist agenda of the Worldwide Wildlife Fund, and the Club of Rome, the Zoological Society of London, is hosting an all-day conference today, the 25th of May. The conference will discuss the reshaping of the global economy to remove any concern for human beings. Featuring speakers from the ZSL, the International Society for Ecology and Culture, the Fauna and Flora International, Royal Veterinary College and the Scottish Wildlife Trust, amongst others, panels will take up topics such as re-envisaging the economy with wildlife concerns as a guiding principle. The ZSL and WWF are insisting that their calls to put animals before humans must be taken up before the forthcoming Rio +20 conference on sustainable development, which will be held between the 20th and 22nd of June. After all, the economic crash has not yet done enough to cause countries to impose significant sufficient population reducing austerity. France's new president, Francis Hollande, showed his true colours at the Chicago NATO summit by agreeing the so-called first phase of the NATO missile defence system, which is presently being commissioned around Russia's borders. The first phase of the missile defence shield comprises batteries of Patriot missiles in Poland and Romania, shipborne SM-3 missiles in the Mediterranean, and radar systems in Turkey. NATO's argument for building the missile defence shield in the first place is that the West is at risk from an attack by Iran. Iran is such a world superpower, it seems, that the US and Europe need to spend billions of pounds and dollars and euros to protect ourselves. While Hollande has so far refused to approve the next three phases, he seems to be a lone voice of opposition within an organisation determined to build what is clearly seen by Russia as a direct threat. In fact, Hollande has made clear that he will only consider any further development of the system if there are serious negotiations with Russia. These negotiations are not happening, and Russia absolutely sees the missile defence shield as a threat to its sovereignty, particularly since the clear interference in its election process via the George Soros-funded NGOs. Russia's Prime Minister Medvedev felt the need to state recently that Russia will not tolerate any outside threat to national sovereignty, and it sees the risk of commissioning of the shield potentially leading to a nuclear war. NATO's response to Russia concerns has been to tell Russia to get stuffed. Of course, that can't be blocked by Russia. It's a NATO decision, said NATO Director General Thor Rosamund at a press conference. NATO has stated that naturally Russia is invited to come and discuss the missile defence shield at any time. That's very nice of them. They have, however, absolutely refused to provide Russia with often asked for legal guarantees that the missiles will never be pointed in Russia's direction. Naturally, the British media portrays Russia as the aggressor. The Economist, for example, published a policy piece at the weekend entitled "Rethink the Reset. NATO should not give in to Russian aggression." It is not Russia that which is deploying missiles on the borders of Europe. So who is the aggressor? With Russia the ultimate target, civil war in Syria continues to be stoked up by foreign advisors, aka special forces. It seems that they are not gaining traction. However, and so their intentions have turned to Lebanon. Lebanon's Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, has been managing a nearly impossible situation since the uprising in Syria, as he has tried to balance the Sunni and Shia communities. This week, violence in Lebanon has escalated into a full-scale emergency. Incidents on Tuesday led to Interior Minister Mawel Shabel calling for a state of political emergency and for a decision on whether or not to impose a state of military emergency. On Tuesday, Lebanese Shiite pilgrims were kidnapped by the ever-peaceful Syrian Free Army as they were returning to Lebanon from Iran. According to Russia Today, the Syrian Free Army are holding the pilgrims hostage pending their release of members of their group by the Syrian authorities. Lebanon itself is now seeing gunmen clashing with Lebanese army in open street battles and protesters blocking the roads. Meanwhile, there is a growing recognition that Syria's armed opposition are terrorists and are being armed and supported from outside Syria, as we reported on this news programme several weeks ago. On Tuesday, Michael Weiss, Communications Director of the Henry Jackson Society, blogged on the Daily Telegraph website that rebel sources in Haiti told him last night that not only is Turkey supplying light arms to select battalion commanders, it is also training Syrians in Istanbul. Men from the unit I was enabled with were vetted and called up by Turkish intelligence in the last few days, and large consignments of AK-47s are being delivered by the Turkish military to the Syrian-Turkish border. No one knows where these guns come from originally, but no one much cares either. On Wednesday, the United Nations Undersecretary for Peacekeeping Missions, Hervé Lassoros, warned at a press conference in Damascus that there is a third-party terrorist group who are trying to gain advantage for themselves. These people are not committed to the cause of the Syrian people, but committed to their own agenda. We do know that there have been terrorist attacks and bombings, and that is taken to be very seriously. And Debaka, the Israeli-based news agency, has reported this week that sources speaking on conditions of anonymity had told them that a recent rash of explosions disseminating Assad's fleet of heavy T-72 tanks can now be credited third-generation anti-tank weapons, specifically 9K115-2 Metas M and Cornet E, supplied by US forces. According to the same source, the firepower is being provided by the way of Saudi and Qatari intelligence agencies, encouraged by President Obama. It emerged this week that President Obama has had Tony Blair sitting on his lap to give advice on his re-election campaign. We wonder if the advice given by the Middle East peace envoy included blow up the world. They will re-elect you out of fear. And finally, if you are wondering where Malcolm Massey is, he is at home recuperating, having lost a fight with a machete. We wish him well and expect to see him back for next week's show. I am Danny Bamping, and this has been the UK Column News. Thank you for watching.